off with the first talk, which is about laboratory performance testing. So these days we've got power meters on bikes, so we get a lot of data from athletes in the field, and that gives us a lot of value. But we still do laboratory performance testing on a regular basis. But due to various different paradigms that have evolved from the past, and just a general lack of critical thinking, people do things and they follow the previous example, and sometimes people don't actually understand why they're doing something. So this is really looking in depth at what we're actually doing when we measure particular variables, how reliable are those variables, and what should we be using them for. And so that'll give you a better understanding of what you're measuring at any given time. So when it comes to laboratory performance testing, there are a couple of different reasons to do it. The one is stratification. So how good is this athlete compared to other athletes that we have known data about? Where do they fit in? Are they an amateur? Are they ready to be in the world tour? Could they be a world champion? That's something that we use just to see, whether or not they've got any given talent at any point in their development. The other aspect relates to that is that you can never tell from one test whether an athlete has the talent to achieve a particular level, because they may not have actually had a long training history and developed whatever physiological talent they have, and so they may at a later stage have a much higher level. So we use laboratory testing to objectively quantify longitudinal analysis. In other words, how do they look now compared to a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago? And how have they changed? Have they improved? And hopefully they have if we're doing the right thing. So it's a nice controlled environment that we can do that. We use it also for training prescriptions. So we look at particularly submaximal variables, and I'll talk about them in more detail when we go through the talk. But we look at certain variables to prescribe certain training intensities. And we can often only do that with laboratory testing, and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. And so we use that to set the training zones for the coming season. And we may adapt them during the season, but it's one of the ways that we do that. And the other one, which we don't use in laboratory testing that much, is monitoring. And when we talk about monitoring, we're monitoring for fatigue predominantly. So checking whether an athlete is still showing signs of normal adaptation to training load, or whether they are decompensating for some reason. So the Lambert submaximal cycling test is an example of one that you can do in a lab or quasi-lab environment, but that's something that obviously takes time and effort, so riders don't do that. Those are sort of the four main reasons why we would want to do that. So there are lots and lots of laboratory tests, and we can't go into all of them, so I'm going to stick to a few of them. The typical examples of testing that we do are incremental testing, so testing that gets harder and harder and harder until a particular point. Sometimes we stop before the person fails, and sometimes, like a peak power output test, we go right up into the point where the athlete fails, and that's a maximal test. So you've got maximal tests and submaximal incremental tests. And how we change the increment can be in steps, so jumping up each time, or it can be continuous these days with electronic ergometers. Okay. Other types of tests that we can do are things like time trials, which you can do in the field or in the laboratory being a nice controlled environment. We can sometimes do a fixed time duration, so your functional threshold power test is a typical example of that. And then in research, and we don't use this in a practical way very often, time to exhaustion tests. So sometimes we set a particular power output and we look at how long it takes before the person gets exhausted at that particular power output, but not something we really use in the lab. But those are just some examples of it. So I'm going to break them down into these particular ones, and we'll talk about maximal tests first, and we'll talk about the VO2 max and related to that, peak power output testing, okay, which we do. These are the two tests we do most regularly in our laboratory, and most laboratories around the world probably do those more than any other test. Okay. And then we'll talk about submaximal ones. We'll talk about the lactate threshold, which is a term that everybody knows, but nobody really understands well, and why we'll talk about in a second. Respiratory thresholds, some of you may know about those. Those are about the gases that you breathe in and out when you're doing a test. FTP tests and where those come from and how they fit in. And then something that we do fairly regularly here is a fat max test. I'll explain that in more detail. So the first question really is, what is peak power output? What is that? If I get on my bike and I go out and I sprint for 5 seconds up a steep hill, I'll see a maximal value of 1600, 1700 watts. Is that my peak power output? Or if I go up a climb for 4 minutes and I do 430, 440 watts, is that my peak power output? What exactly is peak power output? How do we define it? Maybe one that's easier to define in old school terms is VO2 max. What is VO2 max? But let's delve a little bit more deeply into that. So if you read this is from Eric Faria. He wrote a very good set of review papers way back in 2005. So very, very old, but still 2 excellent review papers. If you want to get up to speed with cycling physiology, they're called The Science of Cycling, Part 1 and Part 2. And this is just one table. And the reason I've highlighted it is it shows the different protocols that are used for peak power output testing. Where do they start? So what workload do they start at? 100 watts or 50 watts or 200 watts or 3.3 watts per kilo, etc. And how do they go up? 30 watts, 50 watts, 25 watts. How often do they go up? Every minute, every 4 minutes, every 1 minute? Why is that important? Every one of these protocols differs in terms of the value that they achieve for a peak power output. So if we took one athlete, Alan Hathaway for instance, and we tested him using this protocol, and then this protocol, and then this protocol, he'd give us 3 different peak power output results. And that's because peak power output is an artificial construct. Okay. And it's derived from the fact that your power output that you can sustain for any given time is based on the interaction between multiple different systems in your body that result eventually in fatigue. And fatigue is a subjective phenomena whereby your brain consciously decides that the effort that you're expending to continue this exercise is too much. You no longer have the motivation to continue, to accept the effort required to continue, and you either slow down or stop. And if you've done a VO2 max test or a peak power output test, or even if you've just raced, you'll know that whether you're following somebody else's pace or whether you're on an ergometer that keeps getting harder and harder, you make a conscious decision, I've had enough, and you stop pedaling. Or you start pedaling softer, and eventually the person controlling the test says, okay, you can stop. Okay. It's a conscious decision, but it's based on physiological things that are happening in your body. Breathlessness, pain in your muscles, various other factors. And so if you look at that and how that relates to time, this is a duration of effort in a linear scale, and this is your power output. It's very hard to see on this graph because it starts very high, drops very steeply, and then it goes off. So it's better expressed, and we see this curve more often in a log time scale. So here's log time against power output, and then it has this sort of shape like this, what we call a two-tailed exponential decay function. So the middle of it is a exponential decay curve, and it tails off on that side, and it tails off on that side. In other words, there's a certain power output above which you can't go. You just don't have the muscular strength. And there's a certain duration beyond which you can't go. You get tired, and it's mostly mental fatigue then, and you fall asleep on the bike, or you decide to stop. Okay, and that's how we look at it. And most of us are familiar with that, because if you look at, for instance, WKO4 or Golden Cheetah, everybody now incorporates a power duration curve. Okay, and these are the maximal efforts from an athlete. So this is an athlete that I coach, and each of these little yellow dots is a time duration and the maximal effort that they've done in the last 90 days. And as you can see, they sort of fit on that two-tailed exponential decay curve. So the computer plots the best fit for that curve, and then from that you can calculate, if they did that time duration, what the most likely power output is that they can do. So what's happening in a peak power output test is that you're starting at a low workload, somewhere down here, and it continues to bump up. And it continues to bump up until eventually it gets to the point where it intersects this curve. And that's when you stop. Okay. So the duration of a peak power output test and how quickly the test ramps up determines what your peak power output is. If you do a really long test with small steps, you'll have a low peak power output when the person finally says, I've done. Or if you have a really short test and it ramps up quickly, you'll have a much higher value. Okay. So peak power output is an arbitrary definition of performance, which is based on the chosen protocol and governed by the power duration curve of a particular individual. So if you use a different protocol, you get a different result. So know which protocol you're using and compare apples to apples. Okay. Someone says, oh, my peak power output's 500. There may be 400 if they do a different test. Okay. So you need to know what you're doing. It relates as well to VO2 max, because this paper was published in 2007 by Byung-Kun Jung, and back then his group asked the question, why, if we use a different VO2 max protocol, do we get a different result? And nobody could answer that. Okay. We were answering that to some extent because as part of my PhD dissertation, we looked at the nature of fatigue, and we went right back to the beginning. And where do we get VO2 max testing from? It came from A.V. Hill. He was the Nobel Prize winner in physiology and medicine in 1922. And back then it was quite hard to do VO2 max testing. You used to run around a track, and a guy on a bicycle or a motorcycle rode with you, and they had a huge bag, which was a sealed bag, and you would have pipes, and you would be breathing into it, and they would collect all the air in the bag, tie it off, and then they would go to the lab, and then they would do various different experiments to measure what was left in the bag or what was produced in the bag in terms of carbon dioxide and oxygen. It's called the Douglas bag method. It wasn't easy, so these guys were clever in the way that they did that. Okay, and what he saw was if he ran at 10.9 k's an hour, his oxygen consumption would level off at a particular value. If he ran at 12.1 k's an hour, it would level off at a particular value. And if he ran at 16 k's an hour, it would level off at a particular value. Okay, so the faster he ran, the more oxygen he consumed. But he ran at 16 k's an hour, he was the actual athlete, and he couldn't run any faster. And actually, in fact, he couldn't keep 16 k's an hour going for the full 250 seconds. So he said, at 16 k's an hour, there's something happening and I can't go any faster. Now, some of the other scientists at that time had been doing experiments on frogs, and they took frog muscle and they put it in a nitrogen-only environment, so in other words, no oxygen. And when they analyzed the solution that muscle was bathed in later, they found that it contained an acid, which they later called lactic acid, or lactate. And so they came up with a hypothesis that if frog muscles don't have oxygen, they produce lactate. So in the absence of oxygen, lactate is produced. And A.B. Hill saw this research, and he said, well, an oxygen deficit, according to the frog research, determines fatigue during maximal exercise, because he assumed that oxygen was the most important thing to sustain his exercise. And because I'm tired when I run at 16 k's an hour, I must have an oxygen deficit, right? Hence, an oxygen deficit determines fatigue during maximal exercise. That's what we call a circular argument. Okay, self-fulfilling his own belief. And as a result of that, everybody from that point on believed that VO2 max is determined by maximum oxygen supply to working muscle, and that's why you end up fatiguing at the end of a peak power output test. So he said, considering the case of running, there is clearly a critical speed for each individual, above which the maximum oxygen intake is inadequate, lactic acid accumulates, a continuously increasing oxygen debt is incurred, and fatigue and exhaustion set in. And then from that point on, we had the whole aerobic, anaerobic hypothesis, and that lactic acid was a key indicator of when that occurred, and lack of oxygen was responsible for the final point at which you fatigued. Okay. Is that correct? So this is data from Fernando Beltrami, who did his PhD with us here. And what he did is he did treadmill VO2 max tests, and he made people, so this is oxygen consumption, and this is a step protocol on a treadmill that goes faster and faster and faster. And what he noticed, which most people who do VO2 max tests notice, is that it plateaus. And at a certain point, it gets a flat portion there. And that's one of the reasons why this belief has been sustained. They said, okay, well, if it reaches a flat point, that's obviously the point at which you're not able to deliver oxygen to your working muscles anymore, because your heart has reached its maximum cardiac output and your lungs have reached their maximum diffusion capacity. So that must be the VO2 max. And some people noticed that when they did these protocols, there wasn't a plateau. So they said, well, in those people, the speed obviously wasn't enough. So you must do a quick session afterwards, which is called the confirmation phase, where you go 1 meter per second faster and see whether or not you get a higher oxygen consumption value than during the incremental test. And if you don't, you know you've definitely got the VO2 max. It's just you couldn't see the plateau. It was too short. They gave up too early. Fernando said, okay, I'll do that. So he did your typical VO2 max test. He did your confirmation. He thought, well, and I don't know how he came up with this idea, lots of thinking, I'll do the opposite. We'll start at the speed of the confirmation and let the person slow the treadmill down so that they can keep running for as long as possible. And whenever they get to a point where they want to give up, they can just slow it down a little bit. So he did that. And they had a 5% higher VO2 max. Okay? They used 5% more oxygen than they did in an incremental test. So that's a decremental test. Okay? So what's going on there? Clearly there's not a limit because he exceeded that. Lex Mauger, who's also a well-known researcher in the field, did a similar thing where he used a standard VO2 max protocol, and then he gave the guys the controller and said, you guys control it. You decide when you want to go faster, and you can decide when you want to terminate. And so the athletes did their own VO2 max, and they had I can't remember the exact amount, but also 4 or 5% higher VO2 max value when they themselves controlled the speed and they didn't let the researcher control the speed. Okay. So there are situations where your VO2 max is higher than expected, and that clearly indicates that it's not a critical value above which you cannot go. So why is that the case? Well, the classical model, and this is Bjorn Ekblom, who I think he died recently, and he was one of the doyens of the traditional model, proposed that VO2 max is limited by the maximal capacity of the heart to provide oxygen to the muscles. And that means when one reaches VO2 max, your cardiovascular, and I should add their respiratory system, is working on its limit. Okay. Another alternative model is that your cardiovascular system doesn't reach a limit, and VO2 max is determined by the number of muscle motor units that you are recruiting at the point that you're measuring that. In other words, that the demand determines your VO2 max, not the supply. So in other words, if you have more muscle working, it will extract oxygen, and that will determine your VO2 max rather than a critical limit in the supply. So when you do a cycling VO2 max, you stop and you reach your VO2 max without hitting your maximum heart rate. And we know that if you actually accelerated your heart rate more, your cardiac output, so how much blood you pump in each minute, would actually continue to increase. So at the point at which you reach your VO2 max, your heart is not functioning maximally. And so then the traditional model theorists would say, but it's not the heart then, it must be the lungs. The diffusion capacity is limited, or it's the hemoglobin mass. You're not able to transport that oxygen. Somewhere in the chain, there's a failure. But the point is, we've never been able to demonstrate where that failure occurs, probably because there isn't a failure. And this is your traditional model seen in textbooks, where you have what determines VO2 max? Well, your heart, your respiration, your circulation, and your muscle metabolism. The reality is that probably what determines your VO2 max is your brain. Okay. And the point at which you decide to stop exercising. And if you were able to continue exercising and recruiting more muscle, so if you look at how much muscle you recruit at the point that you decide to stop the VO2 max test, it's about 60% of the working muscle in your leg. The other 40% is not being recruited. Why? Because your brain doesn't want to recruit it. Why? Because it wants to protect you from some homeostatic failure that could cause you damage. Okay? And so your brain is continuously regulating all kinds of variables and making decisions. And we are, as human beings and intelligent creatures, make decisions. We get cold, we seek shelter. We get hot, we take off our jacket. We get hungry, we look for food. You get pain in your muscles, breathlessness, you stop exercising before you do some damage to your body. And when you decide to stop, is really determined by your motivation, and that then determines the point at which you give up. But everybody gives up. And the moment you give up, you realize, actually, I could have gone a bit further. But you decided to give up. And everybody has the same thought. But you always do it. And that's because your brain eventually takes control. Okay? So, if you want to know a bit more about that whole interaction of psychological and physiological homeostatic drives, we published a review this year, or late last year, Zig Sinclair Gibson, myself, and Ross Tucker, and it's described in much greater detail there. Very scientific stuff, but if you're interested, you're welcome to go and read it, and if you want a copy, you can contact me, and I'll send it to you. Okay? So that just gives you more of a critical understanding of what's actually happening when we do a peak power output in a VO2 max test, and what they're actually measuring. All right. So how reliable is VO2 max testing and peak power output testing? A couple of different studies, and they go in descending order in terms of lack of reliability. If we take VO2 max and we measure 3 identical systems in the same laboratory, you will see a 15% difference in measurements. Massive. 10 to 20% difference when comparing the same protocol but using different machines to measure the metabolic gases. So there are many different suppliers of metabolic carts. Okay? There was a meta-analysis, so that's when you look at all the research, and Vickers determined that on average it was about 2.6 milliliters per kilogram per minute different between the different units. We did a study in 2009, Rob Lamberts, myself, and Richard Woolridge, and we took 40 athletes, we brought them back week after week after week, and we controlled everything. We controlled their training load, so their training status didn't change. We even made them wear exactly the same kit, the same meal before the testing session, exact duration between the meal and the testing session, and we got a much higher reliability. And if you look here, this is a table from that paper. You can see that we had a VO2 max test reliability in terms of milliliters per kilogram of 1.3 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and that translates to about 2.2% difference in tests, which is actually quite reliable in terms of testing a human being. But, and this is the important thing, you do a PPO as part of your VO2 max, and there the difference was only 0.9%. So peak power output testing is incredibly reliable. If I test you this week and next week and again, and I control everything carefully, the value will differ by less than 1%. Okay? And in a human being, that's quite a tight level of control. So PPO testing is very reliable. VO2 max testing, if done right, can be quite reliable, but not as reliable. Okay? Twice as much variance as a peak power output test. What does PPO and VO2 max tell us? It does stratify populations really well. This is the relationship between VO2 max and peak power output. Very tight relationship. Okay, and this is from Hawley and Noakes' original study, which was done in the late 90s, I think, or early 2000s. And that had a much longer protocol than the one that we use, but it still had a very tight relationship. And in this, they compared it to a 20K time trial. And the 20 kilometer time trial performance, so that's a critical indicator of performance, was very well predicted by the peak power output of their subjects. In our paper, so this is, once again, very tight relationship between VO2 max and peak power output. There's an R value, 0.96. And if any of you do know stats, that's a very high correlation. And similarly here in absolute terms and relative terms, okay? But we did 40K time trials. So 40K time trials are a good indicator of performance. And you can see a very tight relationship between VO2 max and the power output in the 40K time trials, R values of 0.93 and 0.93. But once again, peak power output testing, R value of 0.96 for your time trial time, the 40K time trial time. So peak power output testing predicts your performance in the field very, very well. Now, Hawley and Oakes' results for their peak power output would have been different to ours. How much? By about 15 to 20 watts difference on average. Yet, both of those predict performance really well. So the protocol that you use doesn't really make a difference in terms of how well it predicts your ability to perform, but the value that you get will be different. So if you test someone on one protocol and then test them on a different protocol, or another individual on a different protocol, you can't use the two different protocols to compare the two individuals. But you can use the evidence that's been published to predict how well they'll do a 40K time trial in the lab. And if you compare other people using the same protocol, you can then stratify. Make sense? Okay? So there have been a lot of other studies which did similar. This is an older study from Bentley that did a 90-minute all-out effort and compared it to peak power output. I think they used the Hawley-Noakes protocol and a whole bunch more. I'm not going to highlight them all, but there have been lots of studies. And in fact, here's a table from Patton and Hopkins where they also look at the correlation between various different performances, 16K, 40K, 20K, etc., and peak power output, and they all have very high correlations. So peak power output is a valid and very reliable way to predict performance. Okay? So peak power output test, you can give a person an indicator of their ability. And in fact, we use something which I'll highlight a little later called the composite score, which we now look anecdotally, we haven't published any of the data, but it correlates with performance even better than the PPO value. It's slightly more valid and reliable than VO2 max testing. Okay? But VO2 max testing is sexy. Okay. So why do we do VO2 max testing? Because it's really cool. Okay. If you just put someone on an ergometer and you say go, and then they ride, and they're breathing normal room air, and they're finished, and you go, here's your PPO, and this is your max heart rate, it's not a laboratory test. It's not a lab test until they've had a gas analyzer on their face. Yes. Let's move on to submaximal tests. There's a bunch of different ones that you can do. The one that probably most people know best is the lactate threshold. And lots of people do lactate threshold testing. And there are literally 36 ways to measure the lactate threshold. These are just random ones that I selected. Okay? This is an example of one. This is the Dmax method. You take the first value and you take the second value. You look at the greatest distance between a point connecting the two and the actual curve fitted to the lactate values, and then where that's the greatest distance indicates the lactate threshold. Well-known method. Now, what if I started the test at 100 watts and the first value was there, and then connected those two? Then the arrow would be pointing to over here, maybe like 20 watts lower. Okay, very arbitrary definition. This is an example of many different definitions. This is from Marcus Aman's paper where he reviewed them. And these are some of the different methods: the Baldari method, 4 millimolar, the curl method, the individual anaerobic threshold, and various ones. And the point is they all give a different value. What do they mean? And how reliable are they? This is the correlation in terms of lactate testing and its ability to predict performance. You saw from a peak power output, we had a correlation of 0.96 being the highest. With lactate testing, the highest one is for maximal lactate steady state, and the Baldari method of 0.72 and 0.71. Okay, so very poor predictor of maximal performance in the field. Okay, and so many different ways to measure it that to kind of compare apples to apples is very difficult, because what one person reports as the lactate threshold is very different to what another person reports. And Marcus Aman's comment on that was the regression analyses between power outputs at the different lactate thresholds and 40 kilometer time trial average watts yielded R squared values ranging from 0.27 to 0.52. We square that R value. That gives us a better indication of the reliability, implying that the analyzed methods have at best a moderate ability to predict 40 kilometer time trial performance. Okay. So lactate threshold testing does not predict performance in the field well. It does it, but it doesn't do it well. For example, this is from Young's paper. This was published this year, and they looked at all the different methods, and these are all the different values they obtained for lactate threshold based on the existing protocols available. And so in one individual, you would range from a LT value of 250 up to 350, depending on which method you used. Okay. And I've highlighted one, which I'll talk in more detail in a second, maximal lactate steady state. And interestingly, it doesn't even fit on the curve. But why is that important? I'll show you in a minute. Okay. Holden McRae wrote a review paper about lactate testing. I did as well with Courtney Jennings way back in 2004. And Holden actually said it better, so I'll use his quotes. And he said, conceptually, measures of lactate concentration have been made because of the historical, and I pointed it out just now, association between lactate accumulation and a reduction in performance, supposedly from muscle hypoxia and anaerobic metabolism. However, when you convert glucose, which is where lactate comes from glucose to lactate using glycolysis, there is no net proton, in other words, a hydrogen ion being formed in that process. There are hydrogen protons consumed and created during various steps in glycolysis, and the final result of lactate does not actually change your pH during exercise. There is an accumulation of hydrogen ions at high intensity exercise, and I can give you a nice link where you can read it. It's very, very complicated. I read it, I understand it, 10 minutes later I've forgotten it, I can't understand it anymore. It's that complicated, but if you really feel like looking at the reason why you get a change in pH during high intensity exercise, I'll give you the link and you can read it yourself, okay? But it's not from lactate, okay? Lactate does not cause acidosis, okay? There is also not a lactate threshold. So you don't go, and suddenly you have this lactate threshold. What happens is you have an imbalance between lactate production, which happens when you have glycolysis. So whenever you use glucose and turn it into energy, you form pyruvate or lactate. And if you can't use the pyruvate, you form more lactate. And there is an imbalance between how much lactate is accumulating and how much you can remove and get rid of, and you get rid of it by using it elsewhere in your body. And when that accumulation and removal starts to become more about accumulation and the removal process is not fast enough, then you get an increase in concentration of lactate. Okay, it's not about aerobic or anaerobic. You don't run out of oxygen and your muscles don't suddenly switch from burning things aerobically to, burning things anaerobically. That doesn't happen. It's just because glycolysis goes faster and faster. The faster you exercise, the more glycolysis you use to produce energy, and you can't use the pyruvate because the pyruvate has to be used in mitochondria. So the Scandinavians showed this very nicely. They went and they took cross-country skiers. And cross-country skiing you can do in two ways. You can do it using just your leg action, or you can have poles and use the poles. Okay. And they stuck a catheter into the femoral artery, and a catheter into the femoral vein, and a catheter into the subclavian artery, and a catheter into the subclavian vein. And then they had these long ports where they put the person on a massive treadmill, and they have these cross-country treadmill things, and basically they sucked blood over like 4 meters out of the body and measured the difference between lactate entering the leg and coming out of the leg, and entering the arm and coming out of the arm, okay? Right to the point of exhaustion. And what they saw was when the guys used a poling action, they would produce more lactate in the legs because the legs were working harder, but that the arms, which were working submaximally, actually had a net consumption of lactate. So the arms had enough mitochondrial mass and enough oxygen to be able to take the lactate from the legs and use that lactate as a fuel. And in fact, your heart, the single most preferential molecule that the heart consumes as an energy source is lactate. Okay? So lactate is actually a fuel that you can use anywhere in your body. It's just a convenient byproduct in the process going from glucose all the way to carbon dioxide and energy. Okay. And that's why, and I think it hasn't been shown, but in mountain biking, if you go up a climb and you get out the saddle and you use your upper body, it's probably a good way to activate muscles in the upper body, which will then consume lactate that's being produced by the legs at various times. And that's probably why they can do continuous explosive efforts and why they get out the saddle and do those, because you can probably use more lactate in the arms and the upper body when you're out of the saddle compared to in the saddle and only using your legs. Okay. So despite the popularity of doing it, there is no scientific reason, I'll get into one reason why in a second, to measure this product of carbohydrate metabolism, and sports scientists and coaches would be misleading the athletes by suggesting that measures of blood lactate concentration can be used to predict endurance exercise performance, and that's the key. It doesn't predict performance. Why measure it then? colleague Inigo San Milan pointed out in a couple of cases that he's done, is when we have athletes that have come to us year on year and they've reached a very high level, Mariska is an example, and we measure their VO2 max and their peak power output 1 year and the next year and the next year, what we see is they no longer have an improvement. Okay. The same applies to many of the other athletes that we coach, and this is an example of a 32-year-old male cyclist who actually won the Giro d'Italia, and this is his VO2 max 1 year, and this is his VO2 max in 2 years later, and absolutely no improvement. But what we do see, and this is the same athlete, is that lactate at a particular workload, and this is watts per kilo, changed from a very higher value to a lower value for the same workload. Okay, and this was when the athlete had come off being a top mountain biker and had not won the Giro d'Italia yet, and this was when they won the Giro d'Italia. Okay, so there is quite a significant difference in the maximal lactate steady state, the point where that accumulation and that redistribution hits out of balance and the concentration in the blood increases. Okay, and that's what we call maximal lactate steady state. Why is that happening? Well, the key thing is that all of the fuels that you use in your body are consumed by the mitochondria, and the mitochondria, which we now know actually came from bacteria. They have their own DNA, bacteria that actually got incorporated into our cells, and what mitochondria do is they convert various substances to energy. And they can use fats, they can use carbohydrates in the form of pyruvate or lactate, and they oxidize them. Okay. And so pyruvate goes into mitochondria, fatty acids go in, oxygen goes in, lactate goes in, and what comes out is carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, which we use for energy. And when you train, the amount of mitochondria in working muscle increases progressively. So very well-trained athletes have a whole bunch of mitochondria, and they are very much greater in terms of their overall size and number compared to an untrained individual. And so they are able to get pyruvate and lactate and fatty acids and convert them into energy at a much faster rate. The glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria. So you take glucose and you convert it to pyruvate, or if you get too much pyruvate, you convert it to lactate outside of the mitochondria. And so at some point, you run out of mitochondrial ability to process those fuels, and then you have to start exporting it. And so you transport it out of the cell into the blood, and that's what we're measuring when we measure skin prick lactate analysis. So what it tells us, these are some of the papers that Inigo has published, is it tells us about your metabolism, not about your cardiovascular. So this is the key thing, is we have to move away from an understanding of cardiovascular respiratory status determines exercise performance, and realize that there's a metabolic component, and you get this change in your lactate curve, which indicates an improvement in your ability to process fuels, both fats and carbohydrates in the form of lactate and pyruvate, into energy. And that is probably responsible for the change in performance that we see in those athletes. They have become metabolically more efficient than they were before. And what we can do with that is we can measure the point at which that occurs, so that we can stimulate the person during their exercise at an intensity just below that decompensation point, so that we maximally stimulate the formation of new mitochondria. Okay. And just because we do it using the same protocol, at the same time we can do fat max testing, which is why we have the metabolic gases, and we look at the point at which, and this is a similar athlete, this is the change from 1 point in 2017 to 2018, and this is at the same intensity. This is their ability to use fats as a fuel source. Now, all of us have got abundant fat stores, and so we've got enough fat to power us for weeks. And if we can improve our ability to use fat, then we reduce the amount of carbohydrate we use up until high intensity when we use the same amount. Eventually, the curves come together. But if you're saving carbohydrate, you will have more carbohydrate later in the race to be able to perform better. Okay. So that's why we do fat max testing and lactate testing. Not to predict performance, but to set training intensities to improve metabolism. Respiratory thresholds, most of you will know about them. They're used in the lab. We're looking at the consumption of oxygen, production of carbon dioxide, and they're two recognized respiratory thresholds. VT1, which is when your oxygen consumption suddenly increases in relation to your VE, VO2, which is the blue line here. That's the amount of times that you're breathing, the volume of air that you're breathing per minute relative to your oxygen consumption. That ratio pops up. And the ratio of air that you're breathing to your carbon dioxide production does not go up. And the partial pressure of oxygen at the end of your breathing, each breath stays the same. Okay, that's called VT1. VT2 is when both go up, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the end of each breath goes down. And I won't go into the details metabolically as to why that's the case, but that's how they're recognized, and they are fairly reliable according to the research. So your VeVO2, so ventilatory threshold 1, 0.8 from the same amount paper, which is high in terms of predicting performance. Okay, so a lot of people use them and go to them. The reality is, and this is just an example of how they relate to performance in a 40K time trial. This paper by Jesus Paladas, which was published I think this year as well, similarly showed very high correlation between ventilatory thresholds and performance in the field, but we don't use them. Why? The definition of your ventilatory threshold is 3 experts who are experts in the field of identifying ventilatory thresholds must agree to where the ventilatory threshold is before you decide on the answer. And here's an example. A friend of mine, Jens, who did a test with us. And if you look for VT1, which is where your VeVO2 suddenly increases, you would say, it's probably here. But it must occur at the point that VeVCO2 doesn't increase, which is the red line, and they seem to both increase there. And your end tidal oxygen must not increase, and it seems to increase there. I would bet anybody that they won't be able to actually definitively define where VT1 is in this. And we see that over and over again. We saw it with Froome when we did his testing in 2015, and we left those out of the results because all of us, and we looked, literally a dozen of us looked at his results, and nobody could identify absolutely with clarity where VT1 or VT2 is. So we actually just left them out of the results. So they're not reliable as far as I'm concerned, even though the literature says that they are. I don't believe it. Okay, and so you can believe the literature or you can believe me, but we don't use them for that reason. I've had too much bad experience. Okay, functional threshold power. This is also this is also maximal effort. Now we're talking about non-incremental. Now we're talking about tests that are done at a steady state. And this was defined by Hunter Allen and Andy Cogan when they wrote their book, Training and Racing with a Power Meter, in 2010. Before that, we didn't have it. So it's a very new term. It's only 8 years old. And they defined it as the highest power output that a cyclist can maintain for about 60 minutes before the onset of fatigue. Okay. Doing a 60-minute maximal effort is probably one of the most painful things you can do. Okay. So it's not something you want to do regularly. So they came up with tests for proxies of it. So there was an 8-minute test that some people do. It's a poor test in terms of its validity and reliability. It doesn't correlate well with the 60-minute effort, and it's not reliable from one test to the next, so don't use it. Doing the full 60 minutes is aversive. In other words, it sucks and nobody wants to do it. So we do a 20-minute test, which is it's easier to do. It's easier to concentrate really hard and suffer for 20 minutes. And the good news is that the 20-minute test is reasonably reliable and valid. You take the 20-minute power output, you multiply it by 95%, and you get the equivalent of a 60-minute power output. That's been scientifically shown. This paper by Borsch shows that it has a correlation of 0.88 with the 60-minute effort, and that also translates really well to performance in the field, because it is 60-minute effort is the same as a 40K time trial. So all the other tests are compared to a 40K time trial. So the 20-minute effort is a reliable and valid indicator of performance in the field. Okay, and that's functional threshold power, which we use to set training intensities because it's a commonly used variable. Okay, it doesn't correlate with any of the other tests that we've seen. Nobody's shown it to correlate with ventilatory threshold or peak power output or any of the other tests, so we don't know how it relates to all the others. How should we go forward? This is data from the Swiss Olympic Testing Center in Lausanne, similar to our lab. they do tests, and what they've done in recent years, this is from an athlete that I coach, they are doing on a huge indoor treadmill, not in the field, mean maximal power output test. They do a 1 minute mean maximal power output test. They do a 5 minute mean maximal power output test, and then they do your traditional VO2 max test. Okay? And they're reporting that. The best indicator of performance is performance, and so doing a 1 minute, 5 minute, and 20 minute mean maximal power output test, your 20 minute one will then be your FTP test, is a good way to document performance. And doing them in a controlled environment like a lab, and you can actually do them now well on an ergometer like a kicker, or you can do them on a treadmill, or if you want to, you can do them out in the field. Right? So the most reliable and valid indicator of performance is performance. So I think we should do 20 minute, 5 minute, and 1 minute MMPs regularly. And we need to be aware that whenever we do a laboratory test, whether it's an incremental protocol or a steady state protocol, the ergometer that you use will determine the outcome. So compare tests to the same ergometer. Your protocol will determine the outcome. The gas analyzer you use will determine the outcome. The lab temperature, there was a study published a month or two ago, I haven't included it, that the lab temperature is very important. If your lab is not cool enough, it dramatically affects the results. We keep our lab at about 20 degrees Celsius, and if it's hotter than that, you start to negatively influence the results. So standardizing everything lets you compare apples to apples. Okay, very important. So use laboratory performance testing for longitudinal tracking. Very useful to objectively quantify them. Use them to set training intensities, so submaximal tests like maximal lactate state test and your fat max test and your VO2 max test using the respiratory exchange ratio, etc. can set your training zones. Don't use the submaximal data to predict performance. They're not accurate. Your lactate turn point, maximal lactate steady state, etc. don't predict performance. VO2 max is fairly meaningless because it tells us nothing extra and it's not as reliable as the PPO. So don't look at VO2 max to predict performance. Use peak power output, but use the same protocol, same standards, and then you can compare apples to apples. We use metabolic gases to look at the submaximal values. That's what we use it for. We don't use it for the VO2 max, although everybody wants to know their VO2 max. Okay. What will we include in our menu going forward? We will continue to use a VO2 max protocol using 20 watts per minute or 25 watts per minute. Both of those have a lot of publications, so you can compare your test results to other data out there. It's the most commonly used protocols are 20 watts per minute or 25 watts per minute, and use a continuous ramp protocol, not a step protocol. So we use a continuous ramp, so our ergometer increases by 1 watt every 3 seconds, okay, or 20 watts per minute, but it's 1 watt every 3 seconds. We use a kicker ergometer. Why? Because it's not very expensive. It means that other coaches and other labs can buy that easily, and you can set up a lab more easily. You get a larger flywheel effect, because one of the things that influences your results is at high intensities, a ergometer is continuously slowing down. It's not like your whole body mass and your bike's mass moving along that have inertia. You stop pedaling, you don't slow down straight away. On most ergometers, you do immediately. And so the kicker has a 16 kilogram flywheel. When you stop pedaling, you don't slow down straight away, so you don't have that immediate resistance that kicks in at your two dead spots. So you actually end up getting a better result. And we look at peak power output, your maximal heart rate, your heart rate and power at the respiratory exchange ratio of 0.95. We report VO2 max because people like it. And the one that we do also report is your composite score. And this is your peak power output watts squared divided by your mass in kilos. And we see that as a better predictor of all-round performance, particularly for endurance mountain biking events and general all-round road racing in South Africa, because we don't have hour-long climbs in South Africa. Our climbs are 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the most, and this composite score is a better predictor of performance in the environments that we generally operate in than straightforward peak power output or straightforward watts per kilo. Okay, so it's watts squared per kilo. We'll do functional threshold power testing, 5-minute MMPs, 1-minute MMTs, and fat max and MLSS testing together. And this will be our menu for now. It'll change because science evolves and we continuously update what we do in terms of our testing, but this is a good menu going forward in terms of results. Okay.